Good evening. Would everybody please take a seat? It's nice to see all of you for our first lecture of the spring 2018 season. My name is Patrick Ladden. I'm the president of the Alexandria Historical Society. And tonight we're going to have a lecture from Dr. Nancy Davis, who's a curator emeritus from the National Museum of American History. Nancy Davis worked at the National Museum of American History since about the mid-90s, right, Nancy? And she was instrumental in many exhibition programs and research projects. The one we're going to hear about tonight is a fascinating lens into the kinds of collections and the actual material culture of what the Museum of American History and our Office of Historic Alexandria also collects. This is a 900-page ledger she's going to tell us about tonight, and it's going to be a terrific opportunity for us to look at the information directly on the screen. Nancy also worked as the deputy director at the Maryland Historical Society. She did a lot of other writing, and I'm not going to go into that because I think you want to hear from her. Nancy has a PhD from the George Washington University. She has a lot of other degrees too. I think you have a master's degree in teaching and lots of other stuff. Nancy, please join us.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And I know that 900 pages sounds really daunting, so we're not going to go through every 900 pages. Do not worry. We'll slim it down a bit. So it's a pleasure to talk to you tonight. And can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. Delightful to talk about this topic, which I think means a lot to you and a lot to me, and I suspect that you may know more about the topic than I do in many ways. And I wondered, this is about the merchant William Ramsay, who was one of the town founders and fathers. I'm just curious how many of you have heard of William Ramsay. Aha, that's what I thought. Okay, that's good. You will hear some things you may know and maybe some things you don't know. So we'll, explore this together. So the talk will look at several customers who purchased from William Ramsay and the articles of the trade that he sold, and through them, as Patrick said, a glimpse into this 18th century life of Alexandria. So some of you probably know that Ramsay was born in Scotland. He was born in 1716, and he arrived in Alexandria in the 1740s. But by 1748, he and several others, which you well know, petitioned the Virginia General Assembly to found a new town on Hunting Creek Warehouse. And this is Washington's 1749 drawing of the plan of Alexandria. The Assembly approved, thank heavens, and they said, quote, "It would be commodious for trade and navigation and greatly tend to the ease and the advantage of the frontier inhabitants." We don't tend to think of ourselves as catering to the frontier, but then it certainly was very popular. Ramsay's familiarity with what later 19th century accounts noted as, quote, "the markets of the world and the laws of the trade," made him very popular with farmers on the frontier, who brought him their produce, and he in turn sold them supplies. So merchant Ramsay prospered in this town that was Alexandria until his death here in 1785. So you probably wonder why I, who am not here in Alexandria, would be so interested in Ramsay. Well, my acquaintance with Ramsay and the objects associated with him stems from my work on an exhibition at the Museum of American History called American Enterprise. It's a permanent exhibition, and it opened in 2015, and here you see the entrance to the exhibition. This exhibition looks at the history of American business from the 18th century to the present day. It explores the transformation of this United States from a very small, dependent nation into one of the world's most vibrant economies. So my contribution is in the earliest section of the exhibition, entitled The Merchant Era. So this is the 18th century to the 1850s. And also the biography wall that runs the entire length of this 8,000 square foot exhibition. Each of the different 4 sections of the exhibition looks at an in-depth understanding of the period through 4 sort of quadrants. The 4 areas in the merchant section include a section on the fur trade in the Northwest, a section which you see to the right here on the global China trade, a section that looks at the business of slavery, and this section, which we're going to talk a lot about, is the merchant's role in the 18th century. So this section really revolves around William Ramsay and his desk and his ledgers. And Ramsay's important because, as we talk about in the exhibition and in the accompanying book, he illustrates one of the very significant aspects of this period, and that's the market revolution. Now, this is a very nonviolent revolution. This is a revolution that affected farmers, the enslaved, artisans, merchants, all the citizens of the nation, because it really transformed the relationship between buyers and sellers. And it began to replace, in this market revolution, a face-to-face relationship between buyer and seller into, from sort of a personal business relationship into one that took place over many distances and over distance. But the market revolution really depended on merchants such as Ramsay. Now, some of you may be familiar with this face, but he didn't stay, so perhaps not. This is one of Ramsay's contemporaries, and his name was Robert Donald. And Robert lived in Alexandria, was a friend of Ramsay's, but unlike his friend, Donald did very well, made a fortune, and didn't stay. He went back to Scotland, and we ferreted out his portrait in Scotland. In these ledgers, these merchants recorded financial transactions and complex dealings regarding goods both near home and, interestingly enough, as you will find out, from across the oceans. So when I began researching this section of the exhibition, I really felt that I wanted to have our visitors understand the concept of the merchant through a material culture way of looking at this, through objects. And the object that made most sense to me was a desk and bookcase, because this really was the merchant's business center. And I also was really interested in the merchant ledgers as a way to talk about merchants' work. So I began to try to find and possibly purchase a desk and bookcase that might illustrate this. Simultaneously, I began to go through in the NMAH archives all the 18th century business and merchant ledgers. You can imagine my excitement when I came across Ramsay's ledgers and many of his papers now completely conserved. So it was very easy reading, unlike many of the other ledgers. So it was very much more tempting. As I began reading through his papers, I found his 1785 will. And I noticed that in that will, he bequeathed all his furniture to his wife with one exception, which was the very first piece of the will, very first entry in the will. And it was itemized as, I give my mahogany desk and bookcase unto my son, William. So I think, I wonder what happened to that desk. I was really relatively new to NMAH at the time, and I began to catch on that the donation of papers had also come with objects. So I began to search our object database on Ramsey. Though I had looked through our object storage, and it's pretty extensive, but I had plowed through it, looking for 18th century desk and bookcase, nothing showed up. And this did not show up because the desk wasn't there, because the desk was here. So I realized, oh my gosh, we have here this desk and bookcase and these amazing ledgers. The desk upon which the ledgers sat. This was, as you can hear from my voice, an immensely exciting moment. And I'm really grateful to the Lyceum and Historic Alexandria staff for really supporting me, graciously assisting me, and their willingness to let us take back that desk. I should also say that on the left-hand side, and I think I can show you this with this little pointer, right here, if you can see these two weights and measures. Because not only was Ramsey a merchant, but he held a public office for the crown. He was the adjuster of weights and measures and seals, and he was the arbiter of all the dry, wet, and weight measures for the market of Alexandria. With these tools, Ramsey determined the accurate quantity of the farmer's produce. And this was important because the stability of that market meant a great deal. It was the fairness of the trade that Ramsey was to ensure. He regulated and protected the community, the consumer, the producer, as well as, of course, the merchant. And these objects, you'll probably see more of them in your, I think, June meeting, when you go to the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, because the rest of them, a great number of them, are there. So, 900 pages of these ledgers from 1753 to 1756. They detail the really busy mercantile life of the town of Alexandria, where Ramsey's store was a community center, a bank, a hardware store, and a department store all rolled into one. A really, we can't conceive of that, but this was the place, and this is where all the activity happened. However, the real meaning and the real value of the ledgers could only be unlocked through thorough investigation and through an understanding of their context and an understanding of their content. And that's a big job, because that's a lot of pages. But several years earlier, at a conference, I had met a woman, Ann Smart Martin, who was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and she was an author of a book that I had read and liked, Buying into the World of Goods, Early Consumers in Backcountry Virginia, by Johns Hopkins University Press. Her work on this book was really very important because it was something that she had spent many years studying, this great account ledger. She learned about this as a student of material culture, and she took this careful look at the Bedford, Virginia merchant John Hook's 1770 account ledger. She went through these ledgers understanding and really plumbing how to read it, what it meant, and the objects that consumers purchased from Hook. So I approached her to help me with this project, and she agreed on this collaboration with NMAH, and this led to a really thorough investigation of the ledgers and the objects related to it with students, with her students, through a semester-long class at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The class was on material culture and museum work, and it really, here you can see us doing our detailed look. The students used the microfilmed ledger entries as their base. And with NMAH, we looked at the objects that would come up, the people that were in the ledger, who had purchased from Ramsey's store, how the ledger worked, and how the consumers paid for their goods. So the way it worked was that I worked closely with them via our email exchange, but then I also went out to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to teach the class. And I also welcomed the students to come to Washington to review the actual objects in the collection that related to those things they'd found in the ledger. But it wasn't quick or easy work. We all had to carefully read, we had to decipher, we had to learn and relearn 18th century terms and all the ledger format. It was complicated. And now we get to see a ledger entry. This extensive research work informed an interactive that accompanies the exhibition. It's below the desk and bookcase. And here you see what the interactive looks like. The interactive helps our visitors really understand how the ledger works, and that the left-hand page here carried the buyer's names. You can see, carries the name. It carries the dates, the purchases, and the costs. And then the right side, the contra side, notes the dates of remuneration, the amount, and the method of payment. Another part of the interactive provides information on the goods and people noted in the ledger. So we had 622 customers' entries in the ledgers. They were all fascinating. But we had to narrow it down to 5 pieces for the media interactive. So in that case, what we did was to have all the students work on these 5 to look at the goods they purchased and the ways in which they interacted with the community. One of them is, as you see, here at the top, was William Elsley, whose name at the top of the ledger is there. And some of you may wonder what the DR is, because you see it everywhere. And at first the student said, how come all these people's names are doctor? I said, no, that means debtor. DR means debtor. So I said, these are really educated people. No, they were all debtors. I should say that William Elsley was a planter, and he was attorney for George Washington and for George Mason. Elsley purchased 2 Sastrakundi handkerchiefs from Ramsey for 3 shillings. And here you can see in the little place there, where the little cross is, where that entry is. I know you can't see it from where you are, but you'll have to take my word for it, it's there. So I just want to mention one thing as an aside, because it could be misleading, and I don't want to mislead. I should note that all the images you'll see of the people in the ledger, up here on the left, with the exception of Donald, who we did find an image of in Scotland, the portraits of these people are all expressive of the 18th century. They are not the actual images of the people. Sadly, we were unable to find portraits of the people that we were going to focus on in the ledger. But we wanted visitors to get a sense of that. So these are the type of people, an image of a person that would probably equate with Elsie. So handkerchiefs, such as what would have been purchased by Elsie. Handkerchiefs were really essential. They were practical and they were fashionable, and they were used by both men and women. A handkerchief could be tucked into the pocket. It could be put on your head, worn about your neck, carried in your hand, or we found also notation that it was used to wipe the dinner knife. But the question was, what's a Sastrakundi handkerchief? Why? Why was that called out as a particular type of handkerchief? So, Shagun Reina, who was a University of Wisconsin student working with us, did the research on this entry and this object. As she began to undertake this study, she found that the handkerchief was called such because it was named for the port in southern India where it was made and shipped out from. So the handkerchief had traveled around the world, from India to Ramsay's store in Alexandria. But the fascinating part of this was that Reina was East Indian. And you can imagine her delight when, after going carefully through the collection, we found a Sastrakundi handkerchief. And there it is. She was very excited.
Must have been kind of big.
So Reina found this project. We really wrapped her in. I feel a little guilty about that, but not too. We really wrapped her in, and she found this so compelling, the global reach so compelling, that when she graduated from the University of Wisconsin, she took a year internship with me at NMAH to assist with this project on American Enterprise. And she did a lot of research on this topic. And I would venture to say that Reina is probably the world's reigning expert on Sastrakundi handkerchiefs. Nobody else knows as much about this handkerchief and these types of handkerchiefs as Reina. Well, another entry focuses on Vorlinda Wade. The widow Wade inherited considerable lands from her husband Zephaniah, who died in 1746, leaving behind 3 young girls to raise. His probate inventory in Fairfax County, found on the immensely helpful George Mason University probate inventory site, indicated that the Wades were quite a prosperous planter family. Their hall and parlor house, which we surmised based on the inventory, which allows you to figure out how the house layout worked, contained a feather bed, numerous other bedsteads, bed furnishings, books, looking glasses, Delftware and china, and a shagreen case holding knives and forks. Zephaniah himself owned silver sleeve buttons, silver shoe buckles, and a silk purse. He was a little bit of a flamboyant guy. It would probably come then as no surprise that Vorlinda's expenditures with Merchant Ramsay were equally fashionable. So here is her ledger entry page. At the time of widow Vorlinda's purchase from Ramsay in 1753, she had 3 unmarried daughters, Sarah, Eleanor, and a daughter named Vorlinda, named after herself. They all lived together in the household. On August 11th, 1753, Verlinda purchased, and you can see it in the, oops, sorry, didn't want to do that. Whoops, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Don't want to do that. Nope. There we are. She purchased 8 pairs, and I was meaning to use this little center button here. 8 pairs of women's best shoes, fine cloth, lace, 1.5 yards of satin ribbon, handkerchiefs, and a woman's waist and hose. And all this you can see in the ledger entry. Interestingly enough, Verlinda was one of the 38 women who were in Ramsay's ledger. And we'll take a look at these shoes now. Assuredly, nearly all of those things that I just mentioned were English, including the 18th century shoes seen here from our collection. Interesting that near the time of this purchase in August, Eleanor was being courted by the tobacco inspector, John Barry of Fairfax. Very possibly these expenditures and all those shoes were made in anticipation of a social activity associated with Eleanor's marriage to Barry. And we know that she married Barry because in 1754 they had a son, William. So, I have to confess, unrelated to the Ramsay ledger, I kind of got wrapped into the Verlinda Wade study. And I actually couldn't help myself, and it had no particular pertinence to the project of American Enterprise, but I had to find out more about Verlinda. So I did a little more research. After the death of widow Verlinda, the mother, before 1765, and then the death of her daughters Sarah and Eleanor, the Wade land passed to the younger Verlinda, her unmarried daughter, as well as to her underage nephew, William. Verlinda, as femme sole, or the unmarried woman, had freedom to conduct her own business. She had freedom to keep her earnings, a freedom to make purchases. So, poking around in the 1765 Glassford and Henderson merchant ledger accounts of Colchester, Virginia, I found that Verlinda, now in her 30s, continued a lifestyle similar to her father and mother. She purchased, and noted in those ledgers, a satin hat, gloves, an apron made of lawn, and other articles under her own name. And her credit was based on her tobacco cast, which was marked VW. In December 1770, Verlinda sold her inherited 75 acres of land on Dogue Run to George Washington for £175. Washington named it Dogue Run Farm. And in 1797, he built a 16-sided barn on the property which today has been reconstructed by Mount Vernon on Verlinda's old farm. So what excited me was that the public can now walk on Verlinda's land today. One of the entries was for Harry. Enslaved Harry's purchases are recorded in Ramsay's ledger, grouped in the ledger with 5 other enslaved people. Harry was owned by the McCarty family, and many of you in the audience probably recognize that name. So based on the research by William T. Ramsay in 1999, the McCarty family is related to William Ramsay through his wife, Anne McCarty. Enslaved Harry's owner, William McCarty, had died earlier in 1743. The Stafford County 1748 to 67 will book notes that McCarty's surviving family granted Negro Harry the use of tools and a plot of land to grow tobacco, corn, and other vegetables, with a portion of that revenue going to the McCarty family. So Harry paid for his linen handkerchief, costing 18 pence, with peas, potatoes, and onions. And it's likely from the land that he worked. Now, Harry didn't come once, he came 5 times to Ramsey's store between November 1753 and June of 1755. At the time he purchased the handkerchiefs, he also obtained thread and coarse, unbleached brown linen called Osnaburg, which is often used to make clothing for the enslaved and for poor white working family households. But interestingly enough, he also purchased gunpowder. And this is salient because it was illegal for the enslaved to have guns except with owner's permission, as based on the regulation going back to the law of 1639 to 40 from the General Assembly of Virginia. Apparently, though, and I know there's some archaeologists here, so I have gotten this information, I think it's correct. Archaeological excavations have found parts of guns and shot in the enslaved homes. And the public markets noted the presence of small game sold by the enslaved, likely killed with shot. So, though it was unusual, it wasn't unheard of. According to Martin, by the 1750s, enslaved persons' exchange of produce for store purchases became quite common. Some enslaved, like Harry, were given passes to permit them to travel, to work for their own money. But despite their earnings, most slaves could not buy their own freedom. Now, one of the account ledgers relates not to a person, but to a vessel. And this vessel was owned by Ramsey. And it has a pretty interesting history. This is not his vessel, but one like it. This 75-ton brigantine Fairfax plied the waters of the Atlantic coast, probably going as far as the West Indies. Such a vessel allowed Ramsey, as a merchant and a trader, to reduce his shipping costs and also to gain a lot more control over his goods. Possibly in 1749 or thereabouts, Ramsey purchased the ship, or he had it constructed by a shipwright. And likely it was constructed in the shipbuilding facilities at Norfolk. So we think likely that's where he may have gotten it, or perhaps he purchased it. The brigantine is a two-masted vessel with a square-rigged foremast, and it was the second most popular vessel constructed in the colonies, the sloop being the more popular. And interestingly enough, the brigantine's popularity was due to its speed, and it was also used for piracy. And I'm not saying that Ramsey was pirate, but because it was very fast, it was used that way very often. Now, owning and maintaining a vessel was very costly. Just provisioning this vessel was expensive. Along with a stone or stoneware mug, which is the one like you've seen here and in Bonnie's collection, it was paid for, is actually costing 9 pence. The ledger also lists as provisions tea, cheese, sugar, twine, a lamp, tools, a hammer, and a gimlet. And a gimlet is a tool used to make small holes in wood so they don't split. And here's the ledger page. The bosun listed on the Fairfax was John McLaughlin, and he probably was the one using the stoneware mug for his rum. Unfortunately, we couldn't find anything. We tried very hard to find information on McLaughlin, but nothing turned up. But it appears that Ramsay found owning the Fairfax pretty onerous. It was a complicated business, it was expensive, and so he tried to sell the brigantine in 1751. He was describing it as he tried to sell it as well-built and well-fitted. But he wasn't able to rid himself of it because the vessel was again advertised for sale in the Maryland Gazette in November 1752. And here it's noted it would be sold, as you can see, with all her tackle and apparel. And since the ledger entries date from 1753 to 54, Ramsay was still stuck with the vessel at that time. So he still had this ship hanging around as a noose around his neck. So we aren't exactly sure to whom Ramsay eventually sold the ship, but it became part of a very complicated shipping venture between George Washington, John Carlisle, and Samuel Brodie. And possibly Brodie at that point was the owner. In 1772, Brodie captained the ship to the West Indies with a cargo of flour from both Washington and Carlisle's mills. Daniel Jennifer Adams was the supercargo and agent. He sold the cargo, later purchased the ship from the captain and renamed it the Anne and the Elizabeth. Well, it goes on. In lieu of a lawsuit against Adams, Washington gained ownership of the vessel. And the name remained the Anne and Elizabeth until he changed it to the Farmer. And he used it for commercial salted herring fishing ventures. So it had a long history, this Fairfax. And now we're on the last entry that I'll look at in a bit greater depth. And that's William Reagan. Reagan was a farmer in Fairfax County who purchased from Ramsay 1 yard of ribbon for 10 pence, as well as some nutmeg. And you can see that we're showing a nutmeg grater. Let's see, right about here, you can see the nutmeg grater. And other items as well. Perhaps we think he bought the ribbon for his wife, Hannah. And then a later entry under William Reagan notes the purchase of ribbons, but this time, most unfortunately, by the estate of William Reagan, because in the intervening time, William had died. And these were described as black crepe ribbons. Unfortunately, we just don't know much more about William Reagan, but we know a whole lot about ribbons. So, we'll talk about ribbons. Martin writes a lot about ribbons in her book. You can see an 18th century ribbon on the right-hand side of the screen, and I have to say that you would think that finding an 18th century ribbon would be really easy. It wasn't. It took a couple of years to find an 18th century ribbon that wasn't attached to a dress or wasn't attached to a hat, but just a ribbon. However, the goods were really well present in Ramsay and also John Hooker's ledgers, and they were all over their shelves. But ribbons were fascinating because they had many uses. They allowed a woman to update her dress by attaching ribbon in a way that would make it more fascinating. Ribbon could trim a hat or could tie up her hair. Ribbons, fortunately, came in all hues, widths, patterns, and also price levels. Because they were relatively inexpensive, they were good ways to be expressive of one's fashion. And they were often subject of comments and letters. As Martin notes in her book, they were small, slight, easy to hide, but likewise easy to display. And it's interesting because they have a history of something that was once very luxurious, extravagant, and expensive, used by people of means, but now are becoming available in all price ranges and accessible to the many. My work on American Enterprise also, and this is a little bit of a diversion, but I think it's interesting, was focusing on a Boston female merchant, Polly Salmon, whose memorandum and expense book of 1785, and you can see it on the left here, is in the NMAH archives. It's in the exhibition, and it's, of course, on the left of the screen. What I found interesting was that Salmon procured goods from large Boston mercantile firms, which she in turn sold. So she passed the goods on and had as a wholesaler, then as a retailer. In 1785, she paid John and Daniel Jenks £4, 4 shillings, all for ribbons. This is a goodly number of ribbons. And now, I know I'm not supposed to do this, scholars aren't supposed to do this, so you really can't tell other people I'm doing this, because I'm telling you this because I think it's really interesting to see how much you would get. Because £4, 4 shillings is roughly $650 today, and that's a lot of ribbons. But we don't usually talk about these costs because we really want to be sure we have the comparables, and I'm not really able to give you a comparable, but it's about more than $650. Ribbons, interestingly enough, were appropriate gifts to show romantic interest. And as such, what I loved about the ledgers was that in Ramsay's notations, they sometimes were called love ribbons. This was just a little trifle that you could bestow on a woman that you were courting. Martin cites, interestingly enough, in her book, a Scots-Irish wedding tradition in the 19th century area of New Hampshire called riding for the ribbon. So friends of the bride and the groom raced by horse to the bride's house to get a bottle of whiskey that was bedecked with ribbons. And you snatched the bottle with the ribbons, and that was tantamount to sort of capturing the bride. So ribbons were indicative, really, of your fashion knowledge. And I talk about this so much because they were a very important part of 18th century life. And when new ribbons arrived in colonial shops, they were quickly assessed for their fashionable currency. A poem in a letter to Miss Fanny Curry records the closing of an owner's shop in Williamsburg, Virginia, when it was overrun by demands for ribbons. So here is the little piece in the letter. No language, dear Fanny, can tell you the rout that in sweet little Williamsburg lately fell out, occasioned, good luck, by the wonderful news of a cargo of ribbons and gauzes and shoes. Well, in a less than merry event, the black ribbons purchased from Ramsay by the Reagan estate, as found in the ledger, were perhaps provided at Reagan's funeral, likely tied around the neck to hold mourning jewelry. In conclusion, we have felt that all this research on people and things, ribbons and brigantines and handkerchiefs and gimlets and shoes, brings the 18th century alive, and therefore the project really needs to remain alive as well. Martin at the University of Wisconsin and the NMH archives hopes this project will continue. Martin has kept at it, the University of Wisconsin, since 2015. She's found money at the university to hire an assistant and to help write grants and to continue the work. Last year at NMAH, we decided to photograph all 900 pages of the ledger in high definition, in the hopes that we'd be able to go forward into a transcription project. Transcription of the entries would make this ledger searchable by terms, by names, by objects, such a great use to researchers studying 18th century life, business, and activities in Alexandria. And the person who's written this is in the audience, so this came just a couple of days ago to prove to you how useful these ledgers are. I'm a professional archaeologist, and I just discovered the site of the 1750 small rural commercial complex, Store Plus, I'm reading his email, of Thomas Waddington. Am I pronouncing it right? Waddington. That store was outside of what is Berryville, Virginia, in Clark County, in the northern Shenandoah Valley, on what is now the Audley Farm Plantation. A portion of his ledger book is extant. Thomas Waddington apparently received some of his goods from Alexandria, Virginia, and William Ramsey. Your indexing, and he's sending this to Ann Martin, your indexing of the William Ramsey ledger shows that Thomas Waddington's account was on page 182. Do you have a copy of this page? So you can direct me so I can obtain it. It just gives you some idea of how useful these ledgers are, because we can connect people and their activities over time. The transcription effort is challenging, and you can see why. Here is a transcription of Henry David Thoreau's calendar of 1860 to 62, recording the migrations of birds and the germination of plants in Concord. And, oops, sorry. This is his handwriting down below here in the bottom. It was, I am sure, a huge effort to transcribe this handwriting. Though the hand of Ramsey's clerk, or perhaps it is even the hand of Ramsey himself, is fairly even, the ledger format makes it a very complicated transcription. 18th century nomenclature and words are really like a foreign language to many of us, and transcribing it is fraught with questions of deciphering. Our next step is to approach the Smithsonian's Transcription Center to be approved as a major project. The Transcription Center is a crowdsourcing transcription project. That means that it helps assist with the preservation and the digitization of handwritten materials in the Smithsonian Institution. And we're doing this, and I will explain how. In August 2014, the Transcription Center website was launched to the public. Volunteers transcribe and review the submitted work before it's sent to approval to SI staff. The final transcription is checked by the Smithsonian curatorial staff, and likely in this case by Martin. Once accepted, both the original images of the work, and we do have those 900 digitized pages, and the transcription itself are provided online. In the past, the Transcription Center has had an open call for anyone wanting to join in on transcribing documents for their many projects. Researchers, historians, educators, history buffs, amateur social scientists, and citizens are all welcome to volunteer to transcribe for any of these projects. The intent, of course, is to make this opportunity an engaging one for the public, and to make the Smithsonian's collections accessible to a broad public, to researchers and scholars. Unfortunately, right now, the Transcription Center has just lost its coordinator, and therefore, at this time, our project is in limbo until a new person is hired, and we can apply as one of the projects. But should it come through, perhaps some of you might be interested in doing some transcription work on these ledgers. See, I have a point behind all this, right? This takes a lot of effort and monies, of course. Several grants have been written by Martin in her role at the University of Wisconsin, and so far they really haven't yielded great results. But we'll keep you updated on our progress and hope the Ramsey Ledgers can be a resource for future research, the study of Alexandria, and really the global 18th century world. And I hope this talk has provided you sort of that intriguing glimpse into Ramsey's ledgers and 18th century life of Alexandria. And we welcome you to visit the American Enterprise exhibition at American History, so you can see the desk and bookcases, the ledger, some of the objects that are like those in the ledger, and also to see the interactive, which you only saw a slight portion of tonight. Also, you can see this online as well, so you can have that opportunity. So I'm very happy to answer questions that you may have about the ledgers or the project, and I thank you for your attention and your willingness to listen through all the ribbons and the gimlets and the brigantines tonight. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah. Considering the limited nature, the limited quantity of Spanish silver coins in 18th century America, can you speak to the various methods of payment for the merchant?
The question was, can we speak to the various methods of payment to the merchant because the Spanish dollar was not so accessible to the general public? Yes, it's fascinating to see what is being given in return for the purchases. A lot of it is peas, onions, and vegetables. There is some paper money that's given in exchange. Bills of exchange are given. Not very much coinage. Quite little, actually, of coinage. A lot in kind, tobacco, but in fact, very little coinage, which is fascinating. And what we don't often realize is that that was quite rare to have coinage. It's a good question.
Well, there are only 2 minutes, Mexico City and Lima.
That's right.
Like, you didn't have any American dollar until 1795 in Philadelphia.
That's right.
I just wondered if it was all barter.
It wasn't completely barter. There's some bills of exchange, some paper money, but very little coinage. Yeah. Does that seem to meet what you know? Yeah. Yes.
So when you say that they bought something for 2 pounds and 3 shillings, what, they didn't have the coins?
It was what was valued. It was what was valued at that. So it was said to value that, but it didn't necessarily mean that they were turning over. In some cases, they may have had the coinage, but by and large, they were bartering or paper money to do that exchange. Yes?
I wanted to ask how the ledger book worked. You said one side was the purchase, the other was the debt. So would a person come in, let's say, and purchase ribbon, and would a debt be written? In other words, was she expected to pay for the ribbon then?
Very good point. What's fascinating is that when we looked at the ledger, we found that some of these accounts were being held over for 1.5 to 2 years. That it was not necessarily a payment at the time, and it would just keep rolling. So Ramsey was, this was not atypical. People would have an account, and it'd be a running account. Sometimes it would not get paid. I think the longest might have been, I may be wrong about this, about 2 years or more that the account kept on going and racking up.
Now, was he a banker in that sense?
He was in that sense. That's why, I think of it as it's more than a store. It's a bank. It's so much more than a store. Yes?
Does that then mean that you didn't get your ready goods?
No, you got the goods,
Okay.
but the account kept going. The ledger was your record of, and you would rectify it. And eventually, of course, you were expected to pay up. Yeah.
Was there any indication of the fact that sometimes he would charge people different costs for different purposes based on their credit?
That's correct. So it did depend on your credit. So if you were good about paying your debts, you didn't have to pay as much. If you were more of a risk, you paid more. Yeah, absolutely. Yes?
I really enjoyed that.
She has interesting information on her own website now too.
Yes.
Lots more objects.
You can go and take a look at, because the students have compiled that, continue to compile that. So you can go and take a look at her website. Yes?
Were there ever any inconsistencies found in the same good being sold for a different price to different people, and any supposed reason for why there might be?
Well, it definitely is, as I was
opposed to
saying.
just the credit.
Yeah, it was really, I would say that it's hard for us to know more than the fact that what we know from commentary is that the difference in price related to the fact, to whether or not you were good for it. It doesn't seem to be, for what we know now, it doesn't seem to relate to gender. That may take some more effort to figure that out, but what we are pretty sure about is that it does relate to your ability, your credit worthiness.
Race or class?
Well, the question is, does it relate to race or class? It doesn't seem to be at this point, but that is still, part of this work could help us understand whether that relates to race or class. But right now, it doesn't seem to be so. We may find that different then. Yes?
For purchasers who live some distance from Alexandria, such as the store out in the Shenandoah Valley, does the ledger include shipping costs?
That's a good point. I don't think so. I suspect that it meant that person came into Alexandria and got those products rather than sending them out to him. It's the way it was with the other ledger in the other two ledgers that we've talked about. Yes. Yes.
Okay, you've got one ledger for the 3 years. I assume he was in business 30 or 40 years. Are there other ledgers that you know of, or is this the only one?
This is the only, there's a question, do we have other Ramsey ledgers? No. This is the only one that we know of that we have. There may be somewhere in some attic, somewhere, there are more. But this is what we have. Yes?
How did the museum acquire the ledgers?
The ledgers came to the museum through the family. So it was through the Ramsey family. Mm-hmm. As well as the other papers that came with it. Yes?
I read before that the secretary bookcase almost had a function as a computer by being able to file things. Did you find any confirmation of that or any mention of that?
There are some great, this was a question about whether the desk and bookcases acted like a computer. I'm familiar with really fabulous desks that are pigeonholed and alphabetized, but this was not. The great thing about this desk is that there are lots of little hidden places that took a lot to open and get at, and it's quite wonderful. I don't know if you can't really see it so clearly on the slide, but if you go in to look at it, you'll see that there are lots of drawers, but they're not alphabetized, but there are slots for where ledgers would be put. So it's not as complete as some other, it's not as much a computerized system as some of the round desks that are actually segmented and alphabetized, and that certainly acted like a computerization system, but this one did not have that. Yes, over here. Yes.
Do you know where the store was, and do you know when the desk was made?
The question was, do we know where the desk was made? I'll take that first. Let me say that I hoped very much and did a lot of research to try to determine that perhaps this desk was American made. But after spending a lot of time with conservators and people at Colonial Williamsburg, they tried very hard to disabuse me of that. And I think they probably were successful. I think it could well be Scottish made. I found lots of similarities to other pieces, but it just wasn't convincing enough. I couldn't, in good conscience say that it was American made, even though I tried. And then the question is about his store. The location of the store, some of you probably know that better than I do. The house, the Ramsey location is there, and you can go visit it. That is maybe more the house. The store may not actually be, it may be, could be slightly underwater. I'm not sure that it was on a location that we may not be able to, and I'm really not absolutely certain about that. But you see where the house is in Alexandria, so you can go look at that. But the store itself, I think we may know, but it's a little unsure. But I could be wrong about that, because I'm not an archaeologist, and I am not completely familiar with sites in Alexandria. Yes, so the question was, how did they pay for imported goods? And I suspect that what happened was that the handkerchief, the Sasrakundi handkerchief, did not go directly from India to Alexandria. It went first to England. So Ramsey was working with another factor in England, and maybe Scotland as well, to get these goods. So it would have been a circuitous process to get these. So maybe I was a little misleading to say that they are East Indian, but they didn't come directly from East India on a boat to Ramsey. They came in a roundabout fashion, probably to England, most likely to England, and then from there to here. There's a lot of interesting, particularly in Anne's book about Hooker. It's really interesting. The American merchant, the colonial merchant, could get pretty annoyed with the balance of back and forth trade with his factor. And oftentimes what would happen is that things would be brought, maybe not here in Alexandria, but they could be brought and go in stages, so that there would be a factor, and then the factor would sell to a wholesaler, then that would come to Ramsey. But oftentimes there was a lot of dispute about who owed what and what was fair. And Anne goes into that in some detail in her book, because there was a lot of annoyance about the occasionally, and probably more than occasionally, unfair balance between paying off and getting goods that were current. They were very angry. The merchants here were very angry when they got things they felt were out of fashion, out of style, and there could not be sold. So in other words, they didn't want to be a dumping ground of unfashionable goods from England. And sometimes they felt they were being treated that way. That's a good question, whether we did a profit analysis. That's part of what this transcription work will allow us to do. It's extremely complicated. Part of it is complicated because the accounts run over long periods of time, and because sometimes it's difficult to read, and sometimes we're not really absolutely sure how to link up the credit and the debt. So I can't, no, we haven't done that, but that's something that is very interesting to figure out. In the book that I mentioned by Anne, she does talk about what his profit margin might have been. She has a fuller understanding of that because I think, to be honest, that ledger account was a little less complicated than Ramsey's accounts were. He was pretty solely active, but Carlyle was here, of course. So there was Carlyle and other people who were, involved in mercantile activities in Alexandria. So he really wasn't the sole person, but he was a pretty prominent merchant. I would say one of the more prominent merchants. He did have competition. Carlyle was here, and there were other competitors. I talked about Donald, who was here. He was a competitor. I mean, they were friends, but they were also competitors. And then there were people on the fall line who were also merchants that were his competitors too. So he wasn't the only game in the broader town, but he was one of the prominent merchants.
Okay, Nancy, it's been really terrific to
Good.
have you with us tonight. Thank you for entertaining so many questions, and this is great stuff.
Good.
Let's hope that translates.
Thanks.